out. We're in a series. All right, here we go. Now we are live. Welcome. Tales of the Cocktail Foundation is really excited to present this full hands-in webinar series today. I'm Lola. I'm the education manager here at Tales, and I am so excited to be joined by two very special guests talking about healthy coping mechanisms during this time and really diving into the topic of mental health. So just want to start by saying this informational kind of webinar is not a replacement for therapy or counseling, but hopefully we're going to give you tools on how to cope in this time. Laura, could you please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit of background, and then we'll have...
For sure. And I'll also add on Lola and what you said about this is not a replacement for therapy. This is essentially psychoeducation. So we're talking about, different, things that are happening in your existence and your emotional life and your, life around mental health. But this is not therapy. It's education. And also, as we go through a lot of these things, it might bring some feelings up in you that are uncomfortable. And just allow yourself within this time, the space to feel those things, forgive yourself for feeling those things, and, just to use this as an opportunity to practice kindness towards yourself and what you are experiencing at this time. So yeah, a little bit about me. My name is Laura Green. I am a licensed professional counselor. I have worked in the industry since I was 17, which is a long time now. But I've been bartending in a more craft context for the last 10 years. More than a few years ago, I went back to school to study clinical mental health counseling, and I got my degree. I found that the industry was a little bit unhealthy, and I was sort of succumbing, that's a word, yeah, to those unhealthy practices, and I wanted out. By the time I finished, though, I realized that I had built and gained the tools to help the industry, so I decided to stick around and focus my time and energy on that. I am still working in the drinks industry. I am the regional spirit specialist for Winebow, where I do a lot of spirits education for smaller responsible brands. And then I started a consultation company called Healthy Pour, where I work with bars and restaurants around their mental health of their employees and staff, and different nonprofits I work with on their education, and hopefully consulting with therapists soon too about how they can help the hospitality industry thrive. So that's me.
Thanks, Laura. Jessica, can you...
Sure. Hello, everyone. I am Jessica Pomerantz. Similar to Laura, I have been in the industry a long time, bartending probably about 10 years. I moved to New York about 5-6 years ago to get my master's in mental health counseling. So I continued working in bars there, and I was learning about gender-based violence, coercion, interpersonal dynamics. And I saw a lot of parallels between what I was learning in school and then what I was practicing or experiencing in the bar community. So I'm currently pursuing my PhD in clinical psychology with hopes of kind of merging those two fields together and really focusing on how we can make the bar industry a safer and more equitable space for everyone in it.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for being here in this space today. This is a safe space to have these discussions. So if anyone's saying anything inappropriate in the chats, out of this space, and asking y'all a couple polls about how you're feeling, about the times, and those are optional, so feel free to answer those as they arise on your screens, and feel free to ask questions with one another on the right hand side. I want to really start off with kind of definitions. I want to talk about emotional intelligence and what that means, and I think sometimes understanding and naming things can be the first step. So can y'all kind of help me?
I can start. So Emotional intelligence is really just like your ability to monitor what you're thinking and then how your thoughts and your actions relate, right? So a lot of times we do this all the time when we're working in bars where you like see someone maybe overreacting in your opinion and you make all of these connections between like what's going on and what their emotions are. So it's taking that and really doing that within yourself and reflecting on what's happening within your own head or within your own space.
Yeah, and so I'll come in and say a little bit more about that. Emotional intelligence and understanding what you're feeling is really a skill that you can build, and it's a really valuable skill. Maggie Campbell of Privateer Rum, she posted something on Facebook a little while ago that I really liked, that she this massive vocabulary, this massive tasting vocabulary, that she could taste a spirit and pull out all of this like beautiful, colorful language about what it was that she was tasting, but couldn't really do the same thing within her emotional life. So she decided to take it upon herself to start making lists of like, okay, this is happening to me. What am I feeling? I feel anger. Let's break it down a little bit further. It's like the same way that you would have I taste wood. Okay, so what does wood taste like? So she started delineating that down. And I thought that was such a beautiful way to talk about and build emotional intelligence. If we can name it, then we can start doing something with that. We can start creating systems in our lives or coping mechanisms, which, I'll bounce it back to Jessica to talk about next. But that's a really fun and very industry clever way to talk about emotional intelligence and to build that for yourself.
Definitely.
I think that's such a great point too, to think about like when you see something or observe something and you immediately feel like say anger or happiness, why is that your immediate reaction? And then is there something from maybe like past experiences that is underlying that? So if you immediately feel angry when you witness something, is that because maybe there's an experience of sadness or something else going on that brings up? And to really like kind of sit with yourself and think about those things, I think is so important.
Absolutely. In vein, I know we're discussing healthy coping mechanisms here, but what does that really mean for people that maybe aren't familiar with that term?
Yeah, so a coping mechanism is essentially any response you have to a stimuli, especially a stressful one. So we generally think about these in adaptive or maladaptive ways. So adaptive meaning just like a positive or beneficial reaction to a stressful stimulus. So this might be like you get stressed out and you go on a run, or you get stressed out and you go meditate. Different things like that. And then maladaptive is maybe the more harmful experiences. So some sort of reckless behavior, or you had a bad day at work and you go get wasted after, different things like that kind of, aren't maybe the most healthy ways to deal with your stress, but that's what works for you.
Unmute. And so coping mechanisms also they're constant, right? So I don't know the show Chernobyl on HBO, but when he's going through, spoilers, at the very end, and he's like, so when the reactor experiences this, these are the things that swoop in to mitigate what's happening there. When it does this, these are the things that come in. So when we're talking about like experiencing a stressor, and within this context, there's a lot of stresses that are happening right now. Coping mechanisms come in to sort of meet that and mitigate whatever it is that you're feeling, that hypervigilance or that pain or that sadness or fear, any of those things. And coping mechanisms can be simultaneously conscious and unconscious. So things might be happening that you're not super aware of that are happening, but they are, because from a survival standpoint, from emotional survival standpoint, your mind is taking care of itself. But then there's also conscious coping mechanisms of like, and this is your emotional intelligence coming in, I'm feeling this way, so now I'm going to go do this in order to cope with that. The awesome thing about that is, since we are able to have conscious coping mechanisms, we can be aware of them and then change them if we have to. And that's kind of, I think, what we're about to talk about next.
I think, yeah, let's kind of dive into how do we kind of create and shape these personal coping mechanisms, and how do we steer them to be healthy rather than destructive?
Yeah, I think for me, the first thing that I think about is knowing what you're talking about, knowing what's going on with inside of you. So you can't change something if you can't identify it first, right? Um, so, thinking about things that you're doing subconsciously or unconsciously to that are thus are your coping mechanisms essentially. So something I might think about as a bartender is if I interact with a stressful guest and I turn around and go up to my coworker and, kind of vent to them. That's a coping mechanism, right? Venting. Or just walking away in general is also a coping mechanism. So those different things that you're doing to mitigate stress or help your body react to it are all coping mechanisms. So identifying them is definitely the first step.
Awesome. Laura, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, identifying what the coping mechanisms are in an effort to go and change them. In terms of creating healthy coping mechanisms for yourself, it's really absolutely important to acknowledge and internalize that your coping mechanisms and what are healthy and helpful for you are very personal. And what might work really well for one person doesn't necessarily work for everybody. We see a lot of content coming at us right now, especially if we're like scrolling through our phones, which is another coping mechanism, of like, do this, try this, do this, be this, get all of this stuff done. This is an opportunity. Like, those are all things that might work for you, might work for somebody else, but don't necessarily. So as you explore your own like personal coping mechanisms and develop sort of that healthy foundation of coping, embarking on that with the understanding that what works for you is going to work for you, and that's not a one size fits all situation. So, being kind to yourself and, working slowly to try new things for yourself and, develop those systems for yourself so that you can continue to exist in this world, in this very strange world right now, is going to be important. Like, for example, I found that like on Saturdays, if I just veg out and do nothing, at first I felt really guilty about that because I was like, I should be doing this, 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 and this. But I needed that veg time because then on Sundays, and this has happened 3 weeks in a row now, so it's tried and true, Sundays I crush it, so but you have to test these things out to figure them out. I'm going to hand it over to Jessica and see if she wants.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. Do you just want to add some questions if you're like, wow, what are my coping mechanisms? Some questions that might be helpful to ask yourself are like, when you have a bad day at work, what's the first thing that you do or the first thing you want to do? Those would be some of your coping mechanisms. Or if you have a fight with your partner, how do you respond? How do you try to, regulate yourself? Just to sit and think about those things and what your behaviors are really helpful to help identify your coping mechanisms if you're struggling to do that.
Definitely. I hear y'all that are very unique per person, but what are some other things that you've seen people practice as a healthy coping mechanism?
Well, so I know the question was about healthy coping mechanisms, but I think it's also important to identify what some of the unhealthy coping mechanisms that our industry in particular happily subscribes to, and myself included. And I also want to say, like, in this, as we talk about this, it's an ongoing process for everybody. And as we develop our healthy coping mechanisms, some things that might have been healthy at one point aren't healthy forever, or within a certain context, or, whatever. And again, it's important to be kind to yourself. But a few things that I see in our industry very commonly would be, first and foremost, substance use as a coping mechanism. And the especially tricky thing about substance use when it comes to alcohol is that it serves so many functions within our it's a creative source, it's a financial thing for us, like we have to work with alcohol in order to, especially as bartenders or like people who are in the drinks profession still, we have to work with it. We appreciate it. It's so delicious. Like, it's so delicious. And it's also like a conduit that connects us in a really profound way. The thing that we all have in common, especially if you're here for Tales of the Cocktail, is that we love and appreciate alcohol. So when it's also a coping mechanism on top of that, it gets a little bit muddy and it gets a little challenging to figure out, when it is that you're educating yourself, or if you are connecting with people through it, or if you are hoping in a maladaptive way. So that's one. And again, that's where, identifying, kind of what your feelings are. Like Jessica said, identifying like you had a bad day. What is your first impulse to go to? If your first impulse is to go to the 4 a.m., I'm from Chicago, so 4 a.m. bars are like danger. To go to the 4 a.m. bar and go for it, the question becomes, am I going to connect with people as a coping mechanism, or am I going to consume alcohol and sort of numb this as a coping mechanism? So yeah, that's one thing that we generally do. And, drinking doesn't have to be this terrible bad thing, but when it's in excess, that's when we start to run into trouble. Another coping mechanism that I see within our industry is overworking ourselves, like working 17, 18-hour days. And what that does is that takes away time for us to reflect on the stressors that we've been encountering. And it's another way to numb and escape the feelings that come from experiencing that stress that ideally we want to be confronting and understanding so that we can grow and the stressor becomes less impactful on us. So work is another one. And sometimes what I see too, especially in the climate of sobriety, is that people will eliminate a coping mechanism like alcohol and then completely swing another way into something like exercise or eating. And again, like exercise, essential to life, eating, essential to life. But when it becomes all encompassing and obsessive and compulsory, that's when it turns into a maladaptive coping mechanism. And I hope the difference makes sense. And again, it's going to be up to you to identify those pieces and those experiences within yourself to see if it is healthy for you to be engaging the way you are, or if it's something that maybe you need to change. But it's important definitely to remember that if you strip a coping mechanism away, your brain is going to find a way to fill that another way. So it's really helpful if you have something sort of on deck to fill whatever coping mechanism you find to be maladaptive to try out, and then just keep assessing that.
Yeah, Jessica, do you want to add to that?
Honestly, no, I think Laura hit the nail on the head there.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you guys one of the questions from the audience that I think rolls off of that. This is from Cameron. Do you have recommendations for addressing these maladaptive coping mechanisms without being unkind to yourself? So this is for those of us who are finding comfort in food or alcohol in ways that don't make us feel good. How do we address these issues and stay kind to ourselves?
Laura, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that one. So if you, another part of developing emotional intelligence is kind of becoming a conscious observer in your experience. So, I felt this. Okay, that felt like this, and this. I reacted this way. That didn't feel super awesome. And you know what? That's okay. It's experiencing things that might have not so desirable outcomes. Those are ways that you are personally collecting data of yourself to be able to say, okay, that didn't work, so I'm going to try something different next time. In terms of being kind to yourself, that's again, that's a learned skill, and consciously, when you are going into developing healthy coping mechanisms and moving away from some that are less than healthy, like making it a point to say to yourself, like, okay, I tried that and that didn't work the way that I wanted to, so I'm going to try something else now, and maybe reframing it from a problem solving standpoint as opposed to, I really messed that up, and I think that in the context of what's happening now, we've all had our moment, or our moments where there was that, that spiral that might have happened. I know that I've experienced it. I've talked to a lot of friends and colleagues who have experienced it. And, it's just a matter of, from there, what are the next you're going to take to try something else to cope when you start feeling that overwhelming sense of stress or fear or whatever. So yeah, my biggest piece of advice there would be to look at it as a puzzle, as a problem solving thing. Like, how can I best know myself, as opposed to, I don't like myself because of this. There are different ways to look at it. I hope that's helpful for you.
Yeah, that was a really good question and great answer. Thank you. Do y'all have any recommendations as we're forming these healthy coping mechanisms, how to kind of stick to them or get a routine that we're, leaning towards the healthier side of these coping mechanisms?
Yeah. And one of those recommendations kind of reverts back to this question that was just asked. It made me think about journaling and like keeping track of how you're feeling on paper. Our brains are so strong and so powerful, and their job is to protect us and our body. And a lot of times our memory does that, reacts to our brains in a way that will protect us. So it will forget harmful or bad experiences or reframe them for us so that they seem positive, or like we remember experiences in a better light than we actually felt in that moment. So I think journaling sometimes can be really powerful in that way. So you can look back on a piece of paper and say, oh, wow, I actually didn't feel great that day, even though, in my head, oh, it was fine, right? So it's holding yourself accountable in a more like tangible kind of way, I think is really important. And then I guess another thing that I've seen be really helpful and kind of set ourselves up for success is making blocks of time to do activities for routines. So instead of saying I'm going to do yoga for 45 minutes at this time, just saying I'm going to exercise, and then allowing yourself that space to do whatever exercise feels best in that moment. So you're still holding yourself accountable, but you're leaving room for flexibility so that you can, go with what you're feeling in that moment, because right now times are so unpredictable and we don't know how we're going to feel tomorrow morning when we wake up. It might be a bad day, it might be a great day. So giving yourself that space to really adjust accordingly, I think, is so important.
So true.
I'll come in on that journaling piece. I usually, like, full disclosure, I get a little itchy when people are like, practice yoga and do journaling, because it's very, I think it sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of, maybe trivializes the best word that I'm going to come up with right now for it, but it kind of trivializes the self-work that's necessary in order to have that personal growth, right? So defaulting constantly to journaling or yoga makes me generally a little frustrated, because I think there are so many other ways. Something that's so helpful though about journaling, and since this whole quarantine situation, I have been full on board with journaling and full on board with yoga, because those are things that you can do by yourself in your home, in the privacy of your own home. You don't need anything besides a piece of paper. With yoga, you can have a mat, but you really don't need one. So these are things that you can really engage in, and that can also be very helpful. What journaling does too is that, coming back to that emotional intelligence piece, it allows you to really start to put your feelings into words, like Jessica said, that you can then go back and look at and reflect on. And vocalizing or writing out these things is incredibly powerful. So if you can't see a therapist right now, because a lot of what therapy is learning how to vocalize these things and then, confront them in a way, and then develop new ways of engaging with the world with all of that in mind. It's kind of therapy light right there. But, you can do that with a journal too, in the meantime, to hold you over until you're in a situation where you could start seeing a therapist, either because of the shutdown or for other reasons too. So really big fan of journaling right now.
Awesome. Before we get to a couple more questions, are there any other recommendations you guys have just for bringing calm into our daily lives during this really wild, not calm time?
I'll hop in. So Jessica has said something in our engagement back and forth about this, about how calm is a very relative word. Like, what does calm look like? And I thought that was so smart, and kind of like did that in my brain too, because for some people, calm is in the chaos of a busy shift, and being in a quiet home is the opposite of their calm. For other people, calm is that quiet, and we are living that right now. So it's really, just like how coping mechanisms are very personal, your idea of calm is super personal as well. So something that I've been thinking about a lot with this is feelings of control. And so I think it's less about finding your calm and taking back feelings of control, because in a time like this, there aren't a lot of ways to really have control. Your general freedoms of being able to hug your friends, go outside, go to the grocery store without wearing a bandana around your face, like, those freedoms have been actively taken away. And so as humans, our impulse is immediately to be like, I want to take back whatever freedom I can. So finding ways to have a sense of control, I think, would be really effective in helping people to find whatever that calm is for them. A few things that I've been thinking about a lot is, taking control of your space, honoring the space that you're in. And I don't want this to be confused with all of these articles that are like, how to be productive during quarantine. It's more about taking control of the space that you're living in and owning where you are. So that might be making sure that your dishes are done, cleaning your house, I actually Googled like places people forget to clean, because I needed to so I'm like, what else is there to do? Finishing projects in your home, or starting something that you've been interested in. A lot of people are baking. A lot of people outside of this industry are learning, how to make cocktails for the first time, how to cook, and so these are ways that people are exacting control and putting their energy into something that they can actually see an immediate benefit from. So thinking about ways to engage yourself in activities like that. And again, it doesn't have to be cooking. It doesn't have to be cleaning your house. It doesn't have to be things like that. And that's where, you have the license to get creative and find those things and find those ways to take back control and feel like you have some sort of hold on the situation when you don't in so many ways. And also accepting the fact that you don't is a really powerful thing too. Doesn't feel good, but it's powerful towards in terms of like helping yourself move forward.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. That there are so many unknowns right now, and to just kind of sit with and acknowledge that you can't control certain things going on right now feels terrible. And like just saying that out loud right now, I get a pit in my stomach, but you have to, acknowledge that and like accept that that is kind of controlling how you feel about the situation is still taking control, right? So knowing that you can control how you react to this craziness is still powerful and can still, empower yourself. Um, Also, I've seen tons of great mental health providers transitioning to telehealth and things like that. So even if, doing the work can't be done within yourself or you feel like you need a little bit of extra support, there are tons of like discounted telehealth options right now for mental health. And then all of the hotlines are still up and running. So you would have domestic violence hotline. There's actually I will share on our chat, there's a disaster distress hotline right now specifically for people experiencing mental health in this distressful disaster. And they have a text option too. So I'll put that in the chat for everyone if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I think we will move on to a couple of these questions. Erica says, and I think this is related to Cameron's question, would you say that honesty comes first and then that leads to kindness? So how does honesty or being true to yourself lead to that idea of kindness to yourself?
That's a great question.
It's like a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah.
I think they kind of function at the same time. I think that being honest with yourself is inherently a kindness. So yeah, like as you become honest about your situation, and I think the next steps are to grow kind, because if you are honest with kind of how you're operating and it's something that you don't necessarily like, finding ways to separate that, you are the one who's doing these things, but you don't have to. So like the behavior can be a little bit separate from who you are as a person or your self-image or any of those things, and being kind to yourself in the sense of like, okay, that's something that I was engaging in. Okay, I don't have to be engaging with that. And then you're like, yo, I'm dope because I don't have to be engaging in that. I can make those changes for myself. I can make, these steps forward to be the best version of myself that I can build, So I think that they go kind of hand in hand, but those first initial steps of honesty are like admittedly pretty brutal. I worked with a therapist that would describe it as like the Tupperware in the back of your refrigerator that you just keep cleaning your refrigerator and you know that it's like kind of rough and you don't want to clean it out and you're like, but I don't want to throw the container away because I like this container. And so then you just keep putting it back. Opening that up is going to suck, but then it's usually not as bad as the time that you are building that up. So do your refrigerator a favor and clean out that Tupperware and, understand that it's something that you did once and you don't have to do it again. And that's amazing.
That is a great analogy. Do you want to add anything to that, Jessica, or did that kind of hit it?
I think that kind of hit it. I mean, at first when you asked that question, I was thinking, can you be dishonest to yourself and still be kind to yourself? And then I was kind of thinking, why would you want to do that? That's just like, you're putting yourself, you're setting yourself up for, not failure necessarily, but like not success. So just being honest and kind to yourself, I think is so important. And yes, I think that analogy was perfect. It can be painful, but the reward is going to be so much greater once it's done.
All right, we have one more question. This is from Amber. And this actually, I think, gets into something we'll touch on in other sessions. But she's asking, how do you talk to others, your friends and family, about your coping mechanism, whether it's healthy or you're trying to move off of an unhealthy one? It's a big question.
To say, first of all, that's awesome that you're in a space that you're able to communicate your coping mechanisms, because that is a huge step. So if that you get to that space, kudos. I think those same conversations you're having with yourself about what's going right and what's going wrong and how you're talking to yourself about that. I mean, maybe you can do it and, reveal less details if that's not something you're comfortable with, but using those same frameworks of being open and honest with the people you love and care about. Some I think about I just need to do this for myself right now. Something I say a lot. And so communicating that it's something that is beneficial to you, helpful to you, and they don't, you're not asking anything of them but to accept you for you. And hopefully if they're your friend or family who you're already communicating these things to, they will understand that because they obviously love you, right?
Yeah, and I'll add to that having conversations like that, especially when we're talking about changing maladaptive coping mechanisms, just going to use drinking as an example. So often shared coping mechanisms, like something like drinking, is really what binds us together and with other. I see a lot within our industry. So it can be a little scary to share on drinking with somebody who you feel such a strong connection to, because you share that coping mechanism that's muddied with the love of drinking and alcohol and work and blah, 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 all of those things. So there is potential when having these conversations to create, I'm going to say this carefully, but to create an ostracizing situation or a self-isolating system, because you don't have that same sort of shared coping mechanism with somebody. So that being said, when you do talk to people, and if the conversation feels scary going into it, if you start feeling your heart racing and you're like, oh man, I really don't want to have this conversation, but I have to have this conversation. Starting with people who like Jessica said, are going to be supportive and going and being like, this is for me. I'm not asking anything of you. I would like your support. And going to the people first who what their reaction is going to be, and that their reaction is going to be supportive and healthy for you to hear. And that gives you an opportunity to practice having that conversation when you get to the point that you're having that conversation with people who might not be as excited, about what it is that you're doing, and a really great way to have this conversation without having the conversation is just model your positive coping mechanism that you are engaging in. So, you don't have to put out on Facebook of yo, I'm cutting back on drinking, I'm going to start exercising every day, or whatever. You don't have to put that on Facebook. Just by engaging in that, it becomes more part of your social circle, and people start seeing that, and they might start doing that on their own. And then you are bringing that shared coping mechanism to you. But again, that's totally not a one size fits all thing, but starting with the people who are going to be especially positively responsive to what it is that you're sharing with them is going to be really helpful to practice to go to the next person and the next person if you feel the need to.
Yeah, thank you. We're getting close to the end here, so I wanted to ask both of you if you have any final thoughts on this topic, and then maybe if you have an example of something you've seen that has really inspired you lately. You want to start, Jessica?
Sure. So I think that something we've seen a lot in this community is we all come together to make drinks and do a job and, do hospitality. But I think that so many of us in this industry also have other hobbies or skills or jobs or careers that they bring to the table too. And I've really seen an influx of people utilizing those skills to benefit others in the community. So I think that's just so amazing to see. Some examples, my girl Amy Probasco, she does a dance party 3 times a week because she's a dancer outside of work. I think that's awesome. You see Jackie Summers and Danny Veras, their virtual happy hours. I went to one of those and didn't know a single person in it and had a phenomenal time. They're just such good entertainers and hosts that, you know, I think if social interaction is something you need in your life, there's so many ways to access that with our technology right now. So I just think that that's such a dope way to use skills that we don't normally get to use behind the bar outside.
Okay, sorry, it wasn't popping up for me. I've been really inspired by the people who are, you know, engaging on a very large and broad social level to see this crisis that we are in and saying, okay, when we come out on the other side of this, there has to be change. We can't go back to like the status quo of what was like. So I've been really impressed with the speed that people have been acting from like a governmental, like a legislative level. It's pretty extraordinary, you know, and I definitely admire it, because when we do come out on the other side of this, you know, we do have choices of where we are, you know, I get nervous for some people because I don't want them to treat this as like a hibernation comatose thing, like this was a sliver of time that existed and then just brush it under the rug when we all emerge from our homes, because you are still like existing, like your life is still happening to you. So, you know, being mindful of how you're treating this time. And again, I don't want to promote being like super overly productive, but being mindful and reflecting in this time of like, this is what I need. This is what I want my life to look like moving forward. And then connecting with people to see how you can have that when we leave our houses and go back to the bars. So yeah, been really impressed with people in that. It's very inspiring.
I agree. Absolutely. Before we kick off, I want to announce, I'm so excited, our partnership with Laura Green. We're going to be doing weekly sessions talking about mental health. And Laura, thank you for joining us for that. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's going to look like?
Yeah, for sure. So it's actually a lot like this. So we'll be talking about, again, it's not therapy, it's psychoeducation. So we'll be talking about things that you might be experiencing right now and helping you put words to some of the feelings that you're having, going a little bit more in depth with substance use, about having challenging conversations, about grief and loss, because if you're not already experiencing that, you're bound to soon, because there are so many changes happening, not just in the world, but within our industry, and, you know, finding ways to cope with that and better understand that. So I'll be having guests with me, you know, Jessica is going to be with me once, and, you know, and having, you know, dialogues that I hope will be helpful for people to be able to exist in this world in a way that is sustainable and has longevity and helpful to your heart and your brain. So yeah, I'm excited for that to happen, and hopefully we can reach a lot of people and help a bunch of people, you know, feel good, feel something.
Yeah, we're excited too. Those are going to be Thursdays at 3 p.m. Central. We'll be hosting those. Well, I think this is the conclusion of our webinar today. Thank you both, Jessica and Laura. You guys are amazing. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I've learned a lot, and we really appreciate you guys. Sending love your way. And join us on Thursday at 3. We'll be back with Laura.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.